What's going on, Mountain Monarchs? Today's May 20th. It's about almost 3 o'clock here. Going ahead with another video today. The second part of our lecture slides for our last unit here. We'll go ahead, watch this video. This video is going to talk about a few things. We're going to go up to about slide 13. We're going to talk about a few things. Normally when I would show you this video, we'd go more into detail on these things. We'd watch videos, especially at the first part, because we're going to talk about the Middle East for a few slides, and then we're going to talk about like economic changes that occurred in the late 20th century that really have changed the world. What's these two parts today that we're going to look at: A, the Middle East; B, economic changes. Both are currently impacting our world. The fallout from kind of decades of unrest, oppression, fighting for oil in the Middle East has caused a lot of international issues. And then on top of that, the rapid growth of a world economy, a globalized economy in the 70s, 80s, 90s to today, have really changed the world that we're living in. So the Middle East part will be lacking a little bit because I'm not in person with you, and normally if there was more pressure on your grades, I'd give you worksheets and videos, but I just want to give you the basic information. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's knock it out. All right, this shouldn't be a very long video. So we're going to talk about modern Middle East briefly on slide 8. So following World War II, a lot of Middle Eastern countries became independent. If you recall, we talked about like Israel, Palestine before. That's kind of a fallout post World War II. Other countries as well also were a part of or were granted independence, and they were kind of given their own territories. Again, the Arab world and the Middle East, the majority of these countries, the majority of the people that live there practice Islam, so they're Muslims. A lot of these countries actually, their constitutions, their laws are kind of rooted in Islamic customs, tradition, and values, similar to like how the United States, a lot of our laws are based in Christian, Judaic law values and whatnot. Both have issues, right? Whenever you base anything off a religion, often, at least a government, you're gonna have sometimes problems. And so in the Middle East, there's a lot of issues in terms of laws regarding like women, like LGBTQ plus groups, just general lacking of equality amongst different groups in the Middle East. The Middle East's most valuable possession is oil. It's what's allowed a place that's, relatively speaking, a very large kind of desert climate, it's harsh conditions to live in. It's what's allowed a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, especially a few, to be relatively successful on the global scale. It's kind of funny because when we start talking about the globalized economy, the need and consumption for oil has gone up and up and up and up and up and so on and so forth, kind of throughout modern history. And obviously a lot of oil goes back to the Middle East. So a lot of these countries and the companies that are based here, they're making a lot of money off of the consumption of oil. Because of that, it's hard for a country like the United States or European countries to challenge or be critical of some of the more controversial laws and practices that occur in the Middle East when it comes to, like, especially women, the rights of women and LGBTQ plus groups. Because if a country like the United States, or let's say a smaller country like Austria, was critical of those countries' governments, chances are their ability to get oil would be affected. And so it's really created a very interesting dynamic. It's this relationship where we have to work with a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, oftentimes when some of the rules and laws that exist in a few of these countries are um, considered very controversial. Um, we'd also talk more in class just about the overall um, historical, just like discrimination and oppression of like the Middle East and Arab people in general around the world. And it's led to a general conflict between the Western world and the Arab world. Um, Radical Islamic groups have formed in the past 30 years, um, and they have gone off to kind of counter the freedoms, the liberties, the more relaxed rules and like regulations, especially when in a country like America, where gay marriage is legal and women are relatively more equal than they are in the Arab world. A lot of the radical Islamic groups don't like that, and so that's why you have the Taliban or Al Qaeda. That's why they've committed terrorist attacks in the past, including 9/11 or bombings in Europe, like in France and whatnot. A couple of years ago, ISIS was a really big deal. And these terror groups are often able to survive because they instill fear. They have religious backing. They prey on poor people, poor neighborhoods, more rural communities, people that are more out on the outside of major cities. And while a lot of these countries have done well, you look at like that picture down the bottom, that's like Dubai, which would be in the United Arab Emirates. Not every Middle Eastern country has done well. Places like Iraq and Syria, even though they do have significant oil reserves, they've gone through dictatorships, civil wars. So a lot of people have fled the Middle East, and so there's panic and there's fear. And as a result, the radical kind of Islamic groups have been able to take control of countries at times, or significant amounts of areas. And this has been going on for many, many years, and it's caused a lot of issues, and it still causes issues to this day. Let's go to slide 9. Just show you, this is like the Middle East flag set. I think this is always interesting. If you notice common colors, you'll see like red, black, white, and green. The majority of the countries in the Middle East share this similar flag coloring system. You'll oftentimes see around the world, regions often share the similar colors. To be honest with you, I don't know the exact reason why they all share their red, white, black, and green, why those colors are present. I'd have to believe it has to do something with Islam, but I could be wrong. If someone knows the answer, let me know. But a common theme that you'll also see is that you will see Arabic writing on a couple of the flags. So that's like, for example, the Saudi Arabia flag, Iraq. You'll see some swords on a couple flags. So Saudi Arabia, Oman, Iran kind of has some flags. I think Afghanistan, if you look, might have flags in there, or not flags, swords, excuse me. So the only odd one out is Israel. They're white, blue, and white, and they have the Star of David. And I guess Qatar, they're kind of like a maroon, but obviously Israel is a Jewish state, and so Israel is kind of the odd bunch in the group. It's another big reason why the Western world and like radical Islamic groups have had beef, because countries like Western Europe and the United States support Israel, and a lot of the radical Islamic groups believe that should be an Arab, a Muslim state for Palestine. And so that's another whole big issue there in itself. But we've talked about that. Again, here we go. This just shows you kind of oil consumption and providers and whatnot. This shows you like the Middle East, or countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. They make a lot of oil. China actually makes a lot of oil. So does Canada. But right here, there's a ton of oil throughout the Middle East. So that's just there to show you. And as long as oil is valuable in the Middle East, and as long as the world values oil, then there will probably always be issues in the Middle East until our need for oil goes away. Because ultimately, the money and the business behind the oil uh, ultimately is what causes a lot of the controversy in the Middle East. Okay. Now we're going to shift into kind of economic and consumer changes that happened in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s. So let's go ahead and look at that. So, kind of starting off in the 80s, we had a really big globalization paired with a technological boom. It was the first time the personal computer became readily available for individuals. That's a picture of Bill Gates. Um, so it's a very interesting photo, but that's like one of the early Microsoft PCs. Computers changed the way people lived, communicated, and worked. Um, uh, Even in the early days of the internet and the computer, it rapidly sped up business. Um, Things became more digitalized. It was easier to communicate with people around the world. And in general, it helped make businesses faster, more efficient, and it saved them money so they can make bigger profits. When you make bigger profits, you can expand, hire more people. So the 80s were this really big time of economic growth. And then by the time we get to the 90s, we see the internet even gets more developed. People start really developing like more personal, their first real personal emails like AOL. You got mail, like all that. That was really big back in the 90s. Computers also gave birth to the earliest cell phones, right? Back in the day, if you wanted to call someone, you had to like get on a payphone. Um, Imagine your world without cell phones. It's pretty hard to imagine that. What you see there in that bottom right is an early cell phone. And I'm trying to find something for scale here. No joke. They were about the size, maybe a little bit smaller than my shoe. I mean, they were pretty big. You could use it. They were like a brick, right? I mean, they were just big, hefty. You usually had a whole briefcase to put them in. Um, and That's like, believe it or not, that's what paved the way. The bottom phone, the picture there, um, that's what paved the way for the iPhone. It's kind of cray, um, and we all know about how much the iPhone, we rely on that today, or the smartphone. No hating. Let's go to the next slide. We're almost done here. We got one more after this. There's even more global economic changes that go through the 70s, 80s, 90s. There's a big shift in where things are made. The USA was actually once responsible for the majority of like world produced goods, but that's shifted away. And as Americans, we shifted away from factory work and focused more on business and service work. Um, it's partially because started becoming expensive to do business in America because there was minimum wage and there were more labor laws. And as time moved on, we had to be more protective. And so businesses were like, well, it doesn't make sense for us to keep doing business here. Let's just go to some off the radar country where there's very limited laws or there's a lower minimum wage and we could probably make business there. Knock, knock. That's where China and India kind of stepped in, and a lot of other countries in the Southeast Asia, especially, and even around the world. They stepped in, and these, at the time, countries that weren't on the same level per se in terms of development as like Europe and the United States, they stepped in. They began producing the majority of the world's goods. That's why today, if you were to look on your clothing right now, I can guarantee you it's either made in China, made in Vietnam, made in Bangladesh, maybe made in Mexico, made in Indonesia. Those would probably be, I guarantee you, if you have something from somewhere else, I'd be surprised. But the reality is the people in these countries are working for less wages. Because these countries are less developed, there's less opportunities. So even though a factory job that doesn't really pay that well, it's kind of dangerous. These workers aren't really well protected. It's better than just living a life in the slums or living a life as a person just kind of making it day by day on the streets. um, factory work. Kind of like when we talked about the Industrial Revolution, when it came and swept through Europe and the United States, people left their life in the farm because they wanted consistent pay and an everyday job. So it's why these countries have really thrived, because they've really dominated the global production game. So just want to, that's kind of important to know. So if you're wondering why things are made in China, that's why. And that kind of leads to this last slide from the 80s to now. All this stuff's kind of happening at the same time. And so it really shifted things for the global economy. So a combination of globalization, the idea of like doing business, like if I open a business, I'm not just opening a business in Hayward. I'm trying to attract people across the United States, across the continent, across the globe. So the combination of globalization, ease of business, communication, and kind of new workforces around the world create a huge spending boom in the 80s. The credit card really was coming out and becoming really popular. You know, it was more convenient than carrying a bunch of cash. It was a little bit safer too. So now people could buy a lot of things, and they bought a lot. People just spent a lot of money because there was such this influx and this huge inflation of money around the world. So this is kind of why like malls were really popular in the 80s and the 90s, because obviously before the internet at the level it is today, if you want to buy something, you still had to go in person. So malls, they just thrived for a really long time during the 80s and 90s. Ironically, though, today, malls are slowly kind of going out of business. Southland has had to try and recreate itself over the years, you know, with putting in like a movie theater, the bowling thing they just put in. They have like the Planet Fitness is there. But unfortunately, just the reality is malls just don't appeal to people anymore. You know, I can just buy things online, and unfortunately, that's why companies like Sears or Macy's or J.C. Penney, at one point were some of the biggest companies in America, and were really doing well, are just now going out of business because people can just buy anything from around the world whenever they want at any time, and they can do so from the comfort of their home. And it's really hard to compete against that. So a lot of this has impacted the way we live today. Think about all the things you buy on Amazon, right? I've bought throughout this whole thing, I bought more than I usually ever do on Amazon, because of the times we're living in. But that's where we're going to end today. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about climate change. Yeah, we'll talk about the kind of the age of terrorism. We'll eventually get to Trump, and we'll kind of finish next week about coronavirus and what's next, and who knows what's going to happen. Hopefully I do. Hopefully I can lead you the right way. But that's it for today. Go ahead and watch this video. Let me know what you think. Make sure you're checking in for the week, and take care. All right. So I'll stop the share, and I'll talk to you guys later.